My name is Madison. I'm 23 years old, and for my entire life, my parents treated me like the punchline to my golden child sister's perfect life. I kept telling myself if I just worked hard enough, if I finally earned my degree, they would see my worth. But the moment that finally made the truth impossible to ignore came on my college graduation day. I walked across the stage and looked out at a sea of 2,000 cheering families. My parents' seats were empty. Instead, my phone buzzed in my graduation gown pocket. It was a text from my mother, sent from an airport lounge. "We cannot celebrate a daughter with a useless art degree, taking your sister to Hawaii instead." I stood alone in the parking lot watching other fathers hug their daughters. No photos of me on the wall, every achievement ignored, every passion ridiculed. I thought I was the problem. I was wrong. My mother had no idea who had been quietly watching my senior thesis presentation. She had no idea how expensive that useless degree was about to become. What happened 7 months later didn't just buy my total independence, it completely shattered the fake, perfect family image my parents had spent decades building. Before I go on, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story speaks to you. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Now let me take you back to the night I packed my bags in an empty house. The house was silent when I got back from the commencement ceremony. I still had my graduation gown on. It felt heavy and hot, a polyester reminder of a day I had spent entirely alone. I walked into the kitchen and saw 3 empty wine glasses on the counter and a smear of expensive brie on a linen napkin. They hadn't even waited for me to leave for the airport. They just left. I sat down at the kitchen island. My graduation tickets, the ones I'd worked 60 hours of overtime at the campus library to pay for because my allowance had been diverted to my sister Chloe's equestrian fees, were still sitting right where I'd left them. They hadn't even been picked up. I reached out and touched the embossed gold lettering on the cardstock. It was the only thing in the house that acknowledged I'd accomplished anything in the last 4 years. I thought back to breakfast a week ago. I was sitting at this same table, trying to tell my dad about my senior thesis. I had been selected as one of the top 5 graduates to present in the university's main hall. It was a big deal. I was explaining the process of my mixed media installation when my mother walked in, carrying 3 shopping bags from a high-end boutique. She didn't ask how my project was going. She didn't ask if I needed a ride to the ceremony. She just started pulling silk sundresses out of the bags and draping them over the back of my chair. "Chloe needs a completely new wardrobe for the Maui trip," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. "She can't be seen in last year's prints at the Grand Walia. It's a matter of standards, Madison." My father didn't look up from his tablet. He just reached out, patted my mother's hand, and said, "Whatever the girls need, Diane." I wasn't one of the girls. I was the one who had stayed home every spring break to work the late shift. I was the one who bought my own textbooks secondhand while Chloe got a brand new SUV for her 19th birthday. I realized then that my father wasn't just passive. He was a silent partner in my erasure. That was the moment I realized they weren't coming. On graduation night, I didn't cry. I went upstairs to my room and pulled a large cardboard box out of my closet. I started taking my life off the walls. I packed my charcoal sketches, my brushes, and the few clothes I actually owned. I didn't take the furniture. They'd remind me it was theirs eventually anyway. I picked up my phone and opened the message from my mother one more time. It was a photo of her and Chloe in the Delta Sky Club, holding up glasses of champagne. The text underneath it felt like a physical weight. "We cannot celebrate a daughter with a useless art degree. Taking your sister to Hawaii instead. Have a nice life, Maddie." I stared at the words, "useless art degree." They didn't know I'd already been approached by 3 different collectors after my presentation. They didn't know because they hadn't been there to see it. I walked over to the full-length mirror and unzipped the graduation gown. It fell to the floor in a heap of black fabric. I didn't hang it up. I didn't fold it carefully. I stuffed it into the box on top of my old shoes. I wouldn't need it where I was going. I looked around my room. It looked like a hotel room I had checked out of. There was nothing of me left in those four walls. I had spent 23 years trying to fill this space with enough achievement to make them notice me, but the harder I worked, the more invisible I became. Chloe was the sun, and I was just the shadow she cast. I carried the boxes down the stairs in 3 trips. Each time I passed the hallway, I saw the framed family portraits. There was Chloe at her debutante ball. There was Chloe at her high school graduation. There was the family in the Hamptons. I wasn't in any of them. I was usually the one taking the photo, or I was at work, so I wouldn't ruin the aesthetic of their perfect weekend. I stood at the front door with my car keys in my hand. The house smelled like expensive candles and old money. It was a beautiful place to be lonely. I realized I'd been homeless in this house for years. I was just finally making it official. I loaded the last box into my 10-year-old sedan. It was 11:00 p.m. The neighbors' lights were mostly off. I didn't leave a note. I didn't send a goodbye text. If they wanted to know where I was, they could check the seat numbers at the graduation they skipped. I pulled out of the driveway and didn't look in the rearview mirror. My mother thought she was punishing me by leaving me behind. She thought that by taking away her presence, she was taking away my value. She was wrong. She had just given me the most expensive gift I'd ever received. She had given me the truth. I drove toward the city, toward the tiny studio I'd rented with my graduation prize money. My bank account was almost empty, and my gas light was on, but for the first time in my life, nobody was telling me what my work was worth. I reached into my pocket and felt my phone buzz again. Another photo of a sunset in Maui. I didn't open it. I just kept driving into the dark. The studio I moved into was a converted garage behind a laundromat. It smelled like damp concrete and industrial detergent. There was no heating, so I spent that first week painting in 3 layers of sweaters. My fingers so stiff I had to soak them in warm water every hour just to hold a brush. I took a job at a cafe 3 miles away, working the 4:00 a.m. shift so I could have the daylight hours for my art. My parents had been back from Hawaii for 3 days when the first damage arrived. It wasn't a phone call. It was a notification. I was sitting in the cafe during my break, my apron stained with espresso, when I saw my mother's latest post. It was a gallery of 30 photos titled The Perfect Graduation Celebration. There was Chloe on a surfboard. There was my father at a 5-star luau. And there, right in the middle, was a photo of the 3 of them, my mother, my father, and Chloe, clinking glasses of Mai Tais. The caption read, "So proud of our girls and all their hard work this year. Family is everything. Celebrating life's biggest milestones in paradise." I stared at the words, "our girls." She made it sound like I was there. She made it sound like the milestone was a collective family win that they had all shared. There wasn't a single photo of me. Not a mention of my actual graduation. To anyone looking at her profile, the milestone was simply Chloe existing in a bikini. Then came the comments. Aunt Linda, who lives in Chicago and hasn't seen us in years, wrote, "So sad Madison couldn't make it to her own graduation. I heard she decided not to walk. Is she doing okay?" My mother's reply was instant. "You know Madison, Linda. She's always been a bit difficult. She decided the ceremony was beneath her and stayed home to brood. We tried to encourage her, but we couldn't let it ruin Chloe's big reward. We're just giving her the space she clearly wants." I felt the air leave my lungs. She wasn't just ignoring my achievement, she was rewriting the history of it. She was telling the entire extended family that I was a pretentious, ungrateful daughter who had snubbed my own graduation. I was being erased from my own life story in real time. I tried to comment. I typed out. I didn't decide not to walk. I was there. You were at the airport. But when I hit send, a red box appeared. User has blocked you from commenting. She had preemptively blocked me so I couldn't correct the lie. She was curated my failure for an audience of 200 relatives and family friends, and she had muted my voice before I could even speak. That was the first real cost, my reputation with my family. An hour later, my phone rang. It was my cousin Sarah. We used to be close, but she sounded cold. Maddie, seriously. Your mom is heartbroken. She said you wouldn't even take their calls on graduation day. Why are you being so mean to them after everything they've paid for? Sarah, they didn't come, I said, my voice shaking. They went to Hawaii. I was at the stadium alone. That's not what the photos show, Sarah snapped. And your mom said you refused to go to the airport with them. Honestly, the tortured artist thing is getting old. You should apologize. Your dad is really hurt that you're acting like this. I realized then that the truth didn't matter. My mother had the photos, the tan, and the social capital. I had a stained apron and a prepaid phone. In the world of suburban country club optics, the person with the best lighting wins the argument. My parents were building a wall between me and everyone I had ever known. They were making me the villain so they didn't have to be the ghosts. By the end of the day, I had 3 more messages from relatives telling me to grow up and stop punishing my parents for being successful. I went back to my studio that night. I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat on the floor, leaning against the cold brick wall. My degree, the thing I had spent 4 years and thousands of dollars to earn, felt like a heavy stone around my neck. I looked at my charcoal drawings. They looked small. They looked like the useless things my mother said they were. For a moment, I considered calling them. I considered saying I was sorry for things I hadn't done just to stop the bleeding. I wanted to go back to being the invisible daughter instead of the disgraced one. But then I remembered the empty seats in the stadium. I remembered the text message from the airport lounge. I stood up and walked over to my largest canvas. It was blank, white, and unforgiving. I picked up a palette knife and a tube of black oil paint. If they wanted a difficult daughter, I was going to give them one. If they wanted to talk about my art, I was going to give them something they couldn't stop talking about. I spent the next 6 hours working in total silence. I didn't check my phone. I didn't look at social media. I blocked my mother back, not just on the app, but in my mind. The damage was done. My family thought I was a failure. My relatives thought I was a brat. The bridge wasn't just burned, it was vaporized. I had no safety net, no family name to fall back on, and no one to call if the rent was late. I was officially a ghost in my own family. I realized that night that being a ghost has one major advantage. People don't see you coming until you're already in the room. I finished the first sketch of a new series at 3:00 a.m. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't the kind of art my mother would hang in her foyer next to the photos of Chloe's horse. It was sharp, jagged, and honest. I washed the black paint off my hands with dish soap. The water was freezing. I looked at my reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink. I looked tired, I looked thin, but I didn't look like a punchline anymore. That was the first lie they told. It wouldn't be the last. The harm didn't stop at social media blocks and whispered rumors. By the second month of living in the studio, the financial weight of my independence started to crush me. I was working 45 hours a week at the cafe and another 15 doing freelance graphic layout for a local coupon magazine. It was soul-sucking work, but it kept the lights on. Then, I got a text from Chloe. It was a photo of her new apartment's living room. My parents had just signed the lease on a luxury 2-bedroom in the city's historic district. A graduation, starter gift for her, despite the fact that she hadn't actually graduated yet. She was taking a gap year to find herself. Hey Maddie, Mom said you're doing some artsy stuff in a garage or something. Anyway, I have this huge blank wall over my velvet sofa. Can you paint a custom portrait of my horse, Barnaby? Make it like 48x60. I need it by next Friday for my housewarming party. Since you're family, I figured you'd do it for free to help build your portfolio. Zoxo. I stared at the screen. I was currently eating a bowl of plain white rice because I couldn't afford eggs. My useless degree had cost me my family, my safety net, and my reputation. And here was Chloe, lounging in a luxury apartment paid for by my father, asking for $300 worth of canvas and 50 hours of labor for nothing. I typed back, I don't do free commissions anymore, Chloe. For a piece that size, my rate is $1,200 plus materials. I can send you an invoice if you're interested. 5 minutes later, my phone didn't buzz. It died. I thought it was a battery issue. I plugged it in, but the screen stayed black. I went to the carrier store 2 blocks away, and the clerk behind the glass gave me a look of genuine pity. The primary account holder called in an hour ago, he said. They reported the device stolen and canceled the line. The hardware is remotely locked. There's nothing I can do. My father had pulled the plug. It was the only lever he had left, and he pulled it the second I stopped being useful to Chloe. This wasn't just about a phone. My portfolio, my gallery contacts, my two-factor authentication for my bank, everything was tied to that number. I was suddenly cut off from the world. I had to walk 3 miles to a library just to use a computer to see if the gallery owners I'd been emailing had replied. While I was walking, I saw my father's car. It was parked in front of a high-end steakhouse downtown. I could see them through the window. My mom, my dad, and Chloe. They were laughing. My mother was wearing a new diamond tennis bracelet that caught the light every time she reached for her wine. They were benefiting from my absence. Without me there to provide a difficult contrast, they could play the role of the perfect, generous trio. My father didn't have to feel guilty about his passivity because my mother had convinced him I was a thief and a liar. Chloe got the apartment, the clothes, and the attention. I was the one paying the bill for their peace of mind. The loss of the phone plan was a calculated move to force me back. They wanted me to come crawling to the steakhouse, apologize for my attitude, and paint the horse portrait just to get my service turned back on. They wanted to prove that my art and my life was only possible if they allowed it. That night, I walked back to the studio in the rain. My shoes were soaked through because I'd glued the soles back on twice, and the glue was finally giving up. I felt a level of rage I didn't know I possessed. I realized that as long as I stayed in their system, I would always be the one who lost. They didn't want a daughter. They wanted an accessory that could be put in a box when it didn't match the outfit. I went to a convenience store and bought a $30 burner phone with cash. It was a plastic piece of junk with a tiny screen and a new number. I sat on the floor of my studio and manually re-entered every gallery contact I had memorized. I didn't call my father. I didn't beg for my line back. I took the stolen phone, walked to the bridge over the industrial canal, and dropped it into the water. I watched it sink. That was the last thing they owned of mine. I spent the rest of the night painting. I didn't have a horse to paint, so I painted the sky over the airport lounge. I painted the color of the text message on my mother's screen. I painted the emptiness of the stadium seats. Every time my stomach cramped from hunger, I put more paint on the canvas. Every time the cold made me shiver, I refined the detail of the useless diploma. I was widening the gap. I was making sure that when I finally spoke again, it wouldn't be through a phone they paid for. A week later, I checked my email at the library. There was a message from a name I recognized, Arthur Vance. He was the owner of the Vance Contemporary Gallery, the most prestigious space in the city. The subject line said, "Your thesis presentation." I felt my heart hammer against my ribs. Arthur Vance was a legend. He was the kind of man my mother bragged about knowing, even though she'd never been invited to one of his shows. The email was short. I watched you present last May. I've been trying to reach your old number. I'm interested in seeing your current work. Please tell me you're still painting. I looked at my hands. They were covered in black oil paint and calloused from the cafe. I looked at my burner phone on the table. I replied within seconds. I'm still painting, I have a new number, and I have something you need to see. The leverage was starting to build. I didn't have a family anymore, but I had a witness. And for the first time in 23 years, I had someone looking at the work instead of the daughter. I walked out of the library and back into the cold. I didn't feel the rain anymore. I felt like a weapon being sharpened. Arthur Vance didn't meet me at his gallery. He sent an Uber to my studio and had me driven to a private members club downtown. It was the kind of place where the walls are paneled in dark walnut and the air smells like expensive scotch and old books. I felt completely out of place in my thrift store coat and paint-stained boots, but Arthur didn't seem to notice. He was sitting in a leather armchair, a folder open on his lap. I watched your thesis, Madison, he said, skipping the small talk. Most students try to impress their professors. You looked like you were trying to survive your own talent. It was raw, it was isolated, I liked that. I sat across from him. I didn't have much of a choice, I said. I was on my own that day. Arthur nodded slowly. I noticed, no flowers, no celebratory lunch. Just a girl packing up a heavy installation into the back of a sedan that looked like it was held together by hope. He leaned forward. I want you in the New Horizon Gala. It's the biggest event of the season. High society, deep pockets, heavy press. I want 3 new pieces from you. One of them needs to be the centerpiece. This was the spillover. My private struggle was about to become public. A week later, the local lifestyle magazine, the City Ledger, ran a feature on the gala's rising stars. My name was at the top of the list. They used a photo of me from my thesis presentation, the one where I was standing in front of my work, looking exhausted but proud. The spillover hit my family's social circle like a tidal wave. I was at the cafe, clearing a table, when my burner phone started buzzing. I hadn't given the number to anyone but Arthur and a few vendors. I looked at the screen. It was an unknown number, but the area code was from the country club neighborhood. Madison. It's Mrs. Gable, I'm Chloe's godmother. Her voice was high-pitched and breathless. I just saw the Ledger, a feature in the Vance Gala. We had no idea you were so successful. Your mother told us you were taking a sabbatical to focus on your mental health, but this is much better. I'm not on a sabbatical, Mrs. Gable, I said, my voice flat. I'm working. Well, clearly, your father must be so proud. He's been telling everyone at the club that he's your primary benefactor. He said he curated your early interest in the arts. We're all so excited to see the work he helped fund. I felt a cold shiver go down my spine. They were doing it. They were hijacking my narrative. My father, the man who had remotely killed my phone and refused to pay for a single tube of cadmium red, was now taking credit for my curation. My mother, the woman who called my degree useless, was telling people she was the one who encouraged my sabbatical. They were using my success to polish their own image. They were making sure that when I stepped onto that gala stage, the audience would believe I was there because of their support, their money, and their refined taste. Then, the final blow of the afternoon arrived. I checked the gala's public RSVP list on Arthur's website. VIP Table 1, the Sterling family. They hadn't just RSVP'd. They had bought the premier table directly in front of the centerpiece pedestal. They were positioning themselves as the patrons of the evening. They were planning to be the first people to hug me when the veil dropped, making sure every photographer in the room captured the happy, supportive family. I went to the back of the cafe and leaned against the industrial fridge. I felt like I was being hunted. No matter how far I ran, no matter how hard I worked, they were always there to put their name on the finished product. My sister sent a text to my new number. I don't know how she got it, probably through Mrs. Gable. Hey, so cool about the gala. Mom is buying a Vera Wang gown for it. She says we need to look artistic for the cameras. Also, can you get me and 4 friends backstage passes? We want to take selfies with Arthur Vance. See you there, sis. The word sis was in quotes. It felt like a threat. They thought I would play along. They thought that because I was a professional now, I wouldn't risk my big break by making a scene. They were betting on my silence. They were betting that I wanted their approval more than I wanted the truth. But they didn't understand the centerpiece. I hadn't started it yet, but as I stood in that cafe kitchen, I knew exactly what it was going to be. It wasn't going to be a portrait of a horse. It wasn't going to be a landscape of Maui. It was going to be a mirror. I went back to my studio that night and didn't sleep. I took the cardboard box from my graduation night, the one containing my black gown and the useless text message printed out on a piece of paper. I looked at the RSVP list again. They were coming to claim the credit. They were coming to act like they were the reason I was standing in that room. That was the trap. They thought they were the audience. They didn't realize they were the subject matter. The story was getting bigger than the 3 of us. It was moving into the high society arena where their perfect family brand was their only currency. If I pulled the rug out now, it wouldn't just be a family fight. It would be a social execution. I picked up a charcoal stick and began sketching the layout of the centerpiece. I felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of them coming to see my work. I was terrified they might stay home. I needed them in those front row seats. I needed them smiling. I needed them ready to take a bow. "I'll see you there," I whispered to the empty room. Arthur Vance didn't just offer me a wall, he offered me a sanctuary. 2 days after our meeting, he arrived at my studio in a sleek black SUV. He didn't come alone. He brought 2 professional art handlers and a check for a 5-figure gallery advance. He walked into my freezing garage, looked at the unfinished canvases, and then looked at the burner phone sitting on a milk crate. He didn't ask why I was living like this. He just pointed at the flight to Hawaii sketch on my easel. "They think they're the patrons, don't they?" Arthur asked. His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that carries more weight than a scream. "My father is telling the country club he funded my entire education," I said, staring at my boots. "My mother is telling everyone I'm on a mental health break and that they're supporting my recovery. They've already bought the VIP table for the gala." Arthur walked over to the sketch and traced the line where I'd blocked out the text message. "I was there, Madison, at the university. I arrived early for the thesis presentations because I like to see the students before they put on their public faces." I looked up. "You were. I saw you setting up," he said. "I saw you carrying those heavy plywood sheets by yourself. I watched you check your phone every 30 seconds for 3 hours. And I watched you realize about 10 minutes before you started that no one was coming. I saw you stand there in that empty hall and decide to do it anyway." He turned back to me. "I know exactly who funded your work. You did. Every hour you spent in that library and every shift you took at that cafe is on that canvas. Your parents didn't give you a career, they gave you a motive." That was the moment the room shifted. For months, I had felt like a crazy person. My mother's gaslighting had been so thorough that I had started to wonder if I was the ungrateful, difficult daughter she described. I had started to believe that maybe I was the one who had chosen to be alone on graduation day. But Arthur's support gave me something more valuable than money. It gave me clarity. He was a witness. He was a professional with a 40-year reputation, and he was telling me that my reality was the real one. "They want VIP lanyards," Arthur said, pulling out his own phone. "Your mother called the gallery 3 times this morning demanding all-access passes for Chloe and her friends. She told my assistant she was the creative consultant for your centerpiece." I felt my stomach drop. "What did you tell her?" "I told her the artist has final say on the guest list. he said with a small, sharp smile. And I told her that in my gallery, consultants don't get passes, only partners do. Since she hasn't signed a single contract or paid a single invoice, she's just another guest. He handed me a sleek, heavy envelope. Inside were 2 passes, one for me and one for him. You're the boss of that room, Madison, not them. They are invited guests of the Vance Gallery, which means they follow my rules. And my first rule is that the artist is never interrupted during their reveal. This support didn't mean I had won yet. If anything, it made the stakes higher. I wasn't just a girl in a garage anymore. I was a featured artist with a reputation to protect. But I wasn't scared. The fear had been replaced by a cold, professional focus. Arthur helped me move my work to a secure, climate-controlled studio at the gallery. I spent the next 2 weeks in a blur of charcoal, resin, and oil. I didn't answer any more texts from Chloe. I didn't check the country club's Facebook page. I was busy building the evidence. The centerpiece was growing. It wasn't just a painting anymore, it was an installation. I used the actual cardboard box I had packed on graduation night. I used the physical black gown, shredded and woven into the texture of the canvas. And in the very center, under a layer of glass that looked like an airport window, I placed the text message. I didn't rewrite it. I didn't make it artistic. I used a high-resolution blow-up of the actual screenshot, time-stamped and clear. Cannot celebrate a daughter with a useless art degree. Every time I felt my resolve waver, I looked at those words. I remembered the smell of the empty house and the sound of the wine glasses clinking before they left. I remembered the stolen phone and the cold water of the canal. Arthur checked on me every evening. He didn't offer critiques. He just brought me coffee and made sure the doors were locked. He was the father I should have had, the one who protected the work instead of trying to own it. One night, as I was finishing the resin coat on the text message, Arthur stood behind me. You know they're going to hate this, he said. I know, I replied. They'll say you're being vindictive, they'll say you're airing dirty laundry. I turned to look at him. They're the ones who put the laundry out for the whole town to see, Arthur. They just lied about whose name was on the tags. I'm just putting the names back. He nodded, satisfied. Good, because the press release goes out tomorrow. I've titled the exhibit The Cost of Attendance. I think your mother will find it very evocative. I felt a surge of adrenaline. The countdown had started. My parents were busy picking out outfits for a night they thought would be their social coronation. They were telling everyone they were the architects of my success. They had no idea I was about to show the world the ruins they had left behind. The leverage wasn't a secret anymore, it was a physical object. I spent the final week before the gala in the gallery's back studio, working behind a locked door. Arthur had given me a key and a security code. No one else was allowed in, not even the cleaning crew. The centerpiece was a 3-dimensional installation that stood 6 feet tall. I had constructed a replica of a departure gate, the same one my mother had texted me from. I used industrial steel for the frame, but the windows of the gate were made of layered glass and translucent resin. When you looked through them, you didn't see a runway. You saw the physical remnants of the life I had left behind. In the first panel, I embedded the shredded remains of my graduation gown. I had spent hours tearing it apart with my bare hands until the black polyester looked like charred wings. In the second panel, I placed the $30 burner phone, its screen cracked and dark. But the third panel was the kill shot. I had taken the original text message, the one that had lived on my phone like a parasite for 7 months, and I had it professionally etched into a massive slab of tempered glass. I didn't change the font. I didn't fix the grammar. I kept the blue message bubble and the tiny, delivered timestamp from the exact hour I was standing in that parking lot alone. We cannot celebrate a daughter with a useless art degree, taking your sister to Hawaii instead. Below the text, I had mounted the 2 graduation tickets my parents had left on the kitchen counter. They were still crisp, never touched, never used. "It's undeniable," Arthur said, standing in the doorway on the final night. He was looking at the way the gallery's spotlights hit the etched glass. The light passed through the words and projected them onto the floor in front of the piece. You couldn't walk past it without stepping on the sentence. "They'll try to say it's a metaphor," I said. "They'll say I'm being abstract." Arthur shook his head. "Hard to call a timestamp a metaphor, Madison. It's a receipt. In this circle, people forgive a lot of things: infidelity, bad investments, even lawsuits. But they don't forgive being tacky. And abandoning a child on her graduation day to go to a mid-tier resort in Maui, that is the height of tacky." I checked my burner phone. I had 3 missed calls from a restricted number. I knew it was my mother. She was likely calling to check on the color palette so she could coordinate her dress. I didn't pick up. I didn't need to hear her voice to know what she was doing. She was out there, right now, telling someone at a pre-gala cocktail party how instrumental she had been in my creative process. The leverage was ready. I had the original digital thread backed up in 3 different cloud drives. I had the physical tickets. I had the gallery owner as a character witness. And I had the centerpiece. "How are we handling the program?" I asked. Arthur pulled a glossy booklet from his pocket. "I've listed the piece as the cost of attendance. The description says, 'A study in parental investment and the market value of a milestone.' I also took the liberty of adding a small special thanks section at the end of your bio." I opened the booklet. It didn't list my parents. It didn't mention the Sterling family name. It simply said, "The artist wishes to thank the 4:00 a.m. shift at the Daily Grind and the University Library for funding this collection in its entirety." That was the final seal. The parents who were currently telling their friends they had sponsored this show were about to be publicly contradicted by the official gallery literature. "What if they try to pull the piece?" I asked. "What if my father threatens to sue?" Arthur laughed. "On what grounds? Defamation. You're displaying a text message they sent you. It's your property. And besides," he leaned against the door frame, "I own this gallery. I decide what stays on the floor. And I've already sold the private viewing rights for the first hour to a curator from the Modern. Your father's money doesn't reach this far, Madison." I felt a weight lift off my chest that had been there since I was 6 years old. For the first time, the system wasn't rigged in their favor. My mother couldn't charm her way out of a physical installation. My father couldn't buy his way out of a printed program. I looked at the centerpiece one last time before we draped the heavy velvet shroud over it. Under the shroud, the etched glass glowed faintly. It looked like a ghost waiting to be seen. "You should go home and get some sleep," Arthur said. "Tomorrow is a long day." "I'm not going home," I said. "I'm going to the studio." "Madison, the work is done." "I know," I said. "I just want to sit in the quiet for a while. I want to remember what it feels like before everything changes." I stayed there for 3 hours after Arthur left. I sat on a crate in the middle of the darkened gallery. The room smelled of floor wax and expensive perfume from the afternoon's setup. I thought about the girl in the graduation gown, sitting in the empty kitchen with the brie on the counter. She was gone. The person sitting in this room now didn't need a ride to the ceremony. She didn't need a good job from a man who couldn't be bothered to look up from his tablet. She was the one holding the veil. I realized then that the leverage wasn't just the text message. It wasn't even the gallery. The leverage was the fact that I no longer cared if they loved me. I only cared that they were held accountable. When you stop wanting someone's love, they lose every bit of power they have over you. You can finally see them for exactly what they are: small people in expensive clothes, terrified that the world will find out they're empty inside. Tomorrow, the world was going to find out. I stood up, tucked the program into my bag, and walked out. I didn't look back at the shrouded piece. I knew exactly what was under there. That was the first night in months I didn't feel cold. The morning of the gala, I woke up in my studio before the sun. The silence was different today. It didn't feel like the isolation of the garage or the exhaustion of the cafe. It felt like the stillness of a heavy door about to swing open. I spent the first 4 hours doing the logistics. This wasn't about art anymore. It was about the mechanics of a reveal. I met Arthur at the gallery at 8:00 a.m. We watched the professional catering team move in, their black-clad staff unfolding linen cloths over tables that cost more than my car. "The centerpiece is positioned," Arthur said, checking his clipboard. "The lighting is slave to the dimmer at the podium. When you're ready to speak, the rest of the room goes to 10%. The spotlight stays on the veil." "And the programs?" I asked. "Distributed, one at every place setting, one at the greeting station." I took a deep breath. This was the logistical move. I had ensured that the evidence, the special thanks to my cafe shifts and the library, was already in the hands of the guests before I even walked into the room. There would be no way for my father to claim he paid for the show once people read that bio. At noon, the emotional move happened. My mother called. I actually answered. "Madison, darling." Her voice was a rehearsed trill of excitement. "We're just heading to the salon. Chloe is getting her hair done in those soft, bohemian waves. We thought it would look so supportive of your artistic vibe. We'll be there at 6:00 sharp for the VIP preview. Make sure you're wearing something presentable." We told the Millers we'd introduce them to our star. "I'll see you there, Mom," I said. My voice was steady. I didn't argue. I didn't bring up the phone or the graduation. I let her stay in her delusion. I let her believe I was still the girl who would stay quiet to protect the family's dinner party. "Good girl," she said and hung up. I looked at the phone. She hadn't asked if I was nervous. She hadn't asked what the work was about. She was only worried about the vibe and the star. The risk move came at 4:00 p.m. Arthur asked if I wanted the Sterling family table moved to the back. "If they're right in front, Madison, the fallout will be immediate. It might disrupt the bidding." "No," I said. "Leave them at table 1, right in the splash zone." It was a massive risk. If I was wrong, they could cause a scene that would get me blacklisted from every gallery in the state. I was betting my entire professional future on the idea that their vanity was stronger than their anger. I was betting that in a room full of people they wanted to impress, they wouldn't dare scream at me. They would have to sit there and take it, or walk out and admit they were the villains of the piece. I spent an hour getting ready in the gallery's private dressing room. I didn't wear a bohemian dress. I wore a sharp, tailored black suit I'd bought with my last 3 cafe paychecks. No jewelry, no ruffles. I wanted to look like the person who had survived them. At 5:45 p.m., the first cars began to pull up. I stood behind the velvet curtain of the main hall and watched through a tiny gap. The room was breathtaking. The high ceilings, the champagne towers, the smell of expensive lilies. Then I saw them. My father got out of the car first, adjusting his tuxedo jacket with the self-important air of a man who thought he owned the sidewalk. My mother followed, draped in a shimmering Vera Wang gown that looked like liquid silver. And Chloe, looking perfectly artistic and entirely bored, trailing behind them. They walked into the gallery like they were the hosts of the evening. I watched my mother stop Mrs. Gable at the coat check. She didn't even say hello. She just pointed toward the shrouded centerpiece and whispered something with a wide, triumphant smile. I saw my father shake hands with a local bank president. He gestured toward the main hall, his chest puffed out. He was already selling the lie. He was telling the story of the father who had nurtured a talent the world was finally recognizing. They were at the height of their performance. They were standing on the threshold of their biggest social win. I walked away from the curtain and found Arthur. He was holding a glass of mineral water, his face unreadable. "Thame here," I said. "I know," he replied. "The room is full, the press is at the back. Are you ready?" I looked at my hands. They were still stained with a faint trace of black oil paint around the cuticles, a mark of the work they hadn't seen. "Let's go," I said. I walked toward the podium. I didn't look at my family. I didn't look at the doctors or the lawyers or the curators. I looked at the heavy velvet shroud covering the flight to Hawaii. The countdown was over. The impact was seconds away. The gala was a masterpiece of social theater. By 8:00 p.m., the air was thick with the scent of expensive bourbon and the quiet hum of people who are used to being the most important person in the room. I stood by the back pillar, nursing a glass of sparkling water, and watched my parents work. They were in peak form. My mother was holding court near the bar, her Vera Wang gown shimmering under the chandeliers. She had her hand on the arm of a woman who owned half the real estate downtown. "Oh, we always knew Madison had this spark," my mother said, her voice carrying perfectly across the marble floor. "It was difficult, of course. Art is such a lonely pursuit. We had to really push her to finish that degree. There were times she wanted to give up, but we told her, 'Madison, your talent is a family legacy.' We've been her biggest cheerleaders since she picked up her first crayon." The woman nodded, looking impressed. "It's so rare to see parents so dedicated to the arts. Most people would have pushed her toward law or medicine." "Not us," my father chimed in, stepping closer. He looked tan, relaxed, and utterly fraudulent. "We've always said that if you have a gift, you have a responsibility. We've funded her studio space, her materials, everything. It's an investment in the future of the family name." I felt a surge of nausea. They weren't just lying. They were performing a scripted play where they were the heroes and I was the lucky recipient of their grace. They were selling a version of me that didn't exist to buy a version of themselves that was even more fake. Chloe was standing nearby, scrolling on her phone, looking up only to smile when a photographer passed by. She had already told 3 people that she inspired the color palette for the main exhibit. Arthur Vance caught my eye from across the room. He gave a small, barely perceptible nod. It was time. Arthur stepped up to the microphone at the front of the hall. The room didn't go silent immediately. It took a few seconds for the heavy hitters to finish their sentences and turn toward the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur said, his voice booming without being loud. "Welcome to the New Horizon Gala. Tonight, we are here to witness the debut of a voice that is as uncompromising as it is necessary." I first saw Madison Sterling's work at her university thesis presentation 7 months ago. I saw my mother straighten her shoulders. She looked toward table 1, where she and my father were seated, and offered a modest, proud parent smile to the people around her. "What struck me that day," Arthur continued, his eyes scanning the room, "wasn't just the technique. It was the solitude. In a hall filled with families and celebrations, Madison stood entirely alone. She had no patrons. She had no cheerleaders. She had only her work and the incredible resilience it took to create it while working 3 jobs to pay for a degree her own family called useless." The room went cold. It wasn't a sudden drop, but a slow, creeping frost. I saw the woman my mother had been talking to pull her arm away. I saw the bank president my father had been schmoozing look down at his program. My mother's smile didn't disappear, it froze. It stayed etched on her face like a mask that had been glued on too tight. My father's face turned a mottled shade of red. He looked at the program in his hand, his thumb hovering over the special thanks section that credited the cafe and the library. "Madison," Arthur said, gesturing toward me, "the floor is yours." I walked toward the podium. The sound of my heels on the marble was the only noise in the room. I didn't look at my parents. I looked at the centerpiece, still covered in its black velvet shroud. I reached the microphone and waited. I waited until the silence was uncomfortable. I waited until the photographer at the front lowered his camera in confusion. "Thank you, Arthur," I said. My voice was calm. It sounded like someone else's voice, older, harder. "Tonight is about transparency. In art, we talk a lot about vision, but vision is expensive. It costs time, it costs money, and sometimes it costs a family." I turned toward table 1. My mother was staring at me, her eyes wide and pleading. She was trying to send me a silent message. "Stop, play the part, don't ruin this for us." "My parents are here tonight," I said. "They've been telling many of you that they funded this show. They've been telling you that they are the architects of my success." My father stood up halfway. "Madison, that's enough," he hissed. It wasn't a loud hiss, but in that silent room, it sounded like a whip cracking. "Actually, Dad, it's not," I said. I didn't raise my voice, I just kept it level. "Because 7 months ago on my graduation day, I didn't have a VIP table. I didn't have a Vera Wang gown, I had a text message." I walked over to the centerpiece. I grabbed the edge of the velvet shroud. "This piece is titled The Cost of Attendance," I said. I pulled the veil. The spotlights hit the etched glass instantly. The massive, blown-up image of the text message flooded the room. The blue bubble was unmistakable. The words were large enough for the people in the very back to read. "We cannot celebrate a daughter with a useless art degree, taking your sister to Hawaii instead." There was a collective gasp. It wasn't a loud one, it was a sharp intake of breath from 200 people at once. The doctor sitting next to my mother leaned forward, his glasses sliding down his nose as he read the timestamp. He looked at the text, then he looked at my mother's shimmering silver dress, and then he looked back at the text. The photographer, sensing the moment, didn't stop. He started snapping photos of the installation, the flashbulbs reflecting off the glass and illuminating my father's horrified face. "Wait," my mother stammered, standing up. Her voice was thin and brittle. She tried to laugh, a high, fluttering sound that died in her throat. "Madison, darling, it's a joke. It's performance art." We sent that as a joke, everyone. It was an inside family thing. "It wasn't a joke when you blocked me from your social media, so I couldn't tell the family I actually graduated," I said. "It wasn't a joke when you reported my phone stolen and cut off my service because I wouldn't paint a free portrait for Chloe. And it wasn't a joke when I was standing in a parking lot alone while you were in a Delta Sky Club." Chloe stood up then, her face twisted in embarrassment. "You're pathetic, Maddie. You're ruining everything over a text. Get over yourself." "I am over myself, Chloe," I said. "That's why I'm standing here. I'm not your shadow anymore. I'm not the difficult daughter who didn't show up. I'm the artist who paid for her own life." Arthur Vance stepped forward, standing right next to the piece. "I can confirm," he said to the room, "that every cent of the insurance and transport for this collection was paid by Madison Sterling from her own earnings. The Sterling family has contributed $0 to this exhibition." The social execution was total. I watched the room react in stages. Mrs. Gable, Chloe's godmother, looked at my mother with a mask of pure disgust. She didn't say a word. She just picked up her clutch, stood up, and walked toward the exit. That was the signal. The high society crowd, the people my parents lived to impress, began to recalculate. They realized they weren't at a celebration of a family, they were at the scene of a crime. And in their world, being caught in a lie is the only unforgivable sin. "We're leaving," my father said, his voice trembling with rage. He grabbed my mother's arm, but she stayed frozen, staring at the projected words on the floor. "Useless art degree." She was looking at the very thing she had used to dismiss me, and it was the thing that was currently destroying her. "Go ahead," I said into the microphone. "The airport is that way. I'm sure there's a flight to Hawaii leaving soon." My father practically dragged my mother out of the hall. Chloe followed, trying to hide her face behind her hair as the cameras followed them. They didn't look back. They didn't apologize. They just fled into the night, leaving their VIP table 1 empty in front of the entire city. The room was silent for a long beat after the doors swung shut behind them. Then, the applause started. It wasn't the polite, rhythmic clapping of a gallery opening. It was a roar. It was the sound of a room full of people acknowledging a truth that had been hidden for too long. I stood by my work. I felt the heat of the spotlights on my face. I looked at the etched glass. The leverage had been deployed. The story was finally mine. For the rest of the night, I didn't have to explain myself. People came up to me, not to talk about our girls or family legacies, but to talk about the brushwork. To talk about the light, to talk about the art. One woman, an older collector who rarely spoke to anyone, squeezed my hand. "The most expensive part of that degree wasn't the tuition, was it?" she whispered. "No," I said, "it was the silence." "Well," she said, looking at the empty table where my parents had sat, "it sounds like you finally broke it." I stayed until the very end. I watched the catering staff clear the tables. I watched the lights dim. And finally, it was just me and Arthur in the empty hall. "What now?" I asked. Arthur looked at the centerpiece. "Now we sell it. I've already had 6 offers. The highest is from the museum." I looked at the text message one last time. "Good," I said. "Let everyone see it." The aftermath wasn't an explosion. It was a slow, cold evaporation. My parents didn't call to apologize. They didn't send a letter explaining their side. They simply stopped existing in the local social registers. The woman who owned the real estate firm withdrew her membership from my mother's charity board the next morning. My father was asked to step back from the country club's finance committee to avoid unnecessary distractions. I heard through a cousin that Chloe moved to Florida to stay with a friend. She told everyone the art world was toxic and that I had manipulated the truth for fame. It didn't matter. The screenshot was public. The gallery program was archived. The lie had been outpaced by the receipt. 3 months later, I stood in my new studio. It's a real space this time, high ceilings, floor-to-floor windows, and a heater that actually works. I bought it outright after the cost of attendance was purchased by the National Museum of Contemporary Art. They didn't just buy a painting, they bought a piece of history. It hangs in the permanent collection now, right next to the exit sign, a reminder of what it looks like when someone finally refuses to be a ghost. I still have the cardboard box from graduation night. It's tucked away in the back of my closet, empty now. I don't need the gown or the old sketches to remind me of where I came from. I have the calluses on my hands for that. The most important thing I've learned is that family isn't the people who share your last name or your holiday photos. Family is the person who stands in the back of the room during your thesis presentation when no one else shows up. Family is the person who keeps the doors open when the world tries to shut them. I spent 23 years waiting for my parents to see me. It turns out I just needed to see myself. I'm painting a new series now. It's full of color, vibrant, loud, and unapologetic. There are no shredded gowns. There are no airport lounges. There is just the light coming through the windows and the sound of my own breath in a quiet room. I looked at my phone this morning. There was a notification from a suggested friend on social media. It was my mother's new private profile. The profile picture was a blurry shot of a sunset in Maui. I didn't click on it. I didn't feel the need to see if she was happy or if she was still wearing the Vera Wang. I just swiped the notification away. I have a life to build, and for the first time the foundation isn't made of their permission. It's made of my own work. I'm no longer the punchline. I'm the one holding the brush. Have you ever had a family member try to take credit for something you sacrificed everything to achieve? What was the moment you realized you had to stop asking for their approval? Drop your story in the comments. I read every single one of them. If this story resonated with you, check out this other video about a golden child whose life of privilege finally hit a wall they couldn't buy their way through. And if you're finding your own voice and breaking family cycles, hit that subscribe button.